If the person you once loved the most abandoned you at your weakest moment, then unexpectedly returned years later, could you forgive them? Today's story is about a boy selling candy under the scorching sun of Houston, a single mother hiding the pain of illness, and a successful man burdened with late regrets. When fate brought them back together, not at a lavish party, but in a hospital room filled with the scent of antiseptic, the truth about a child turned all past values and choices upside down. This is not only a story about responsibility and mistakes, but also a profound lesson in fatherhood, compassion, and second chances. Follow the story to the end and tell us, if it were you, would you open your heart to forgiveness or choose to close it forever? On a Sunday afternoon in early May, the River Oaks Mall in Houston was lit up and bustling as usual. Music from a birthday party upstairs echoed down, blending with cheerful conversations and polite laughter. Catherine Thompson, CEO of a major real estate corporation, sat at a table draped in white satin, her eyes, marked with the faintest crow's feet, still sharp and commanding as ever. She was past 38, seasoned, accomplished, and above all, a woman who always knew what she wanted in life. But that day, just as the birthday song ended and guests began raising their glasses, Catherine suddenly froze at a very small, very ordinary sight, yet it tugged unexpectedly at her heart. Near the lobby, by the dessert corner for children, a thin, rugged man stood silently beside a small pushcart. A worn baseball cap covered half his face, but his eyes were clearly visible, sincere, and deeply weary. He wasn't begging. Instead, he quietly laid out warm bread rolls on a tray, next to a handwritten sign, "Please support. I have 2 children and a sick mother." Catherine stood up instinctively. She didn't know why she did, only that a strange feeling was welling up inside her, part pity, part confusion, and a bit of unspoken pull. She walked toward the man. Her steps were slow but deliberate. Part of her had grown tired of hollow toasts and calculated handshakes. Another part, perhaps the deeper one, saw a different version of herself from years ago, someone who once stood quietly in the crowd, silently hoping someone might stop and listen. The man looked up as she approached. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disrupt the birthday party. I just need to sell a few loaves so I can buy medicine for my mother tonight." Catherine didn't respond immediately. She looked at him for a few seconds, not with the scrutinizing gaze of the wealthy toward the poor, but with the eyes of someone who had lost enough to know that everyone, at some point in life, stands outside the crowd. A breeze from the central air system stirred her hair gently. She gave a faint smile. "What's your name?" "Michael," he replied, gripping the handles of the cart as if trying to hold on to the last threads of dignity. "Michael, I want to buy all your bread, but on one condition." He looked up, surprised, a hint of suspicion in his eyes. Catherine tilted her head, her voice still as gentle as the breeze. "Sit down and eat one with me. Just one. There's more than enough food at this party, but sometimes people are hungrier in the heart than in the stomach." Michael hadn't yet answered when a little girl from the birthday party ran past, clutching a balloon, her eyes gleaming with excitement, her laughter ringing clear and bright. Amid the lively scene, a warm loaf of bread and a single, suggestive sentence stirred something within him, not gratitude, but a fragile sliver of hope, like the flickering flame on a birthday candle just blown out. About 10 minutes later, in a quiet corner near the mall's large glass windows, Michael sat across from Catherine. Between them was a modest box of bread and 2 iced teas from the food court. A simple scene, oddly out of place amid the sleek world around them, where silk dresses, designer bags, and expensive perfumes weaved through the main lobby. Catherine pulled out a napkin, gently brushing away a few crumbs from the edge of the table. She didn't rush to ask anything. She simply observed. The way Michael bowed slightly in thanks when receiving the tea, the quiet manner in which he split the last loaf in half for her, and most of all, his eyes. They seemed to avoid contact for too long, as though he feared someone might see what he was trying to hide. "Do you sell bread here every day?" Catherine finally spoke after a stretch of silence. Michael nodded. "I started earlier this year. My mother had a second stroke. The meds are expensive, and insurance. Well, it doesn't cover enough. I used to work at a packaging plant, but after the layoffs, I was let go." He smiled, but it was fleeting, like the flickering lights on the store sign nearby. "Now I just hope to make enough each day. No extra, no shortage, Just enough to live and not let anyone else hurt. Catherine looked at him intently. The stories she had heard, the ones she'd signed sponsorships for, the ones arranged by PR to make headlines, none of them were like this. None had the raw honesty of that simple sentence, just enough so no one else hurts. "And your wife?" she asked, her voice softer now. Michael shook his head slowly. "She left 3 years ago, right when our daughter turned 4. Said this life wasn't what she wanted. And me. I couldn't blame her." Another silence rolled in, broken only by the distant voices of shoppers and the mall announcements echoing promotional deals. Catherine suddenly felt annoyed by the sound. It was too cold, too indifferent. She turned back to Michael. "Where's your daughter now?" "At home with my mother. I left her some milk before heading out. Not many customers today." Maybe the party inside drew them all in. Catherine tightened her grip on the glass of iced tea, her eyes suddenly distant. Something in his voice reminded her of herself back when she was 20, standing quietly behind the scenes of a lavish party, listening to others laugh and talk, too afraid to step in. Not because she was poor, but because she felt she didn't belong. She looked up at Michael and gently asked, "If I offered help, would you refuse it?" Michael paused, his expression guarded. "What kind of help?" "Not money. I don't want you to think of this as charity." Her tone was firm, but not harsh. "I have a small bakery, severely understaffed. If you need a job, a real job, with a contract, insurance, monthly salary, then come to this address tomorrow morning." She pulled out a pen, wrote on the back of a napkin, and slid it across the table. Michael stayed silent for a long while. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. His deep brown eyes looked up at her for the first time, long enough to truly see. He said nothing, but in his gaze was genuine gratitude. And then, very quietly, Michael said, "This is the first time someone's asked me that, not out of pity, but out of trust." Catherine smiled. In that moment, she didn't know exactly what made her do it. Maybe it was his eyes, maybe it was the daughter she never had, or maybe it was just the human heart, recognizing another, at the right time, in a world overflowing with things, but starved for kindness. The next morning, as sunlight gently filtered through the thin curtains in East Houston, Catherine was carefully reviewing the day's delivery schedule at her small bakery when the doorbell rang. She looked up and wasn't surprised to see Michael standing outside, holding his worn cloth cap, his shirt freshly ironed despite frayed edges, his face beaded with sweat, but his eyes carried something unmistakable, perhaps hope or quiet determination. "You came," Catherine said softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear and pointing to a neatly folded apron on the chair. "Here, the job's waiting." Michael stepped into the shop, glancing around. Catherine's bakery wasn't big, but everything was tidy and warm. The scent of baked bread, vanilla, and butter filled the air, a comforting aroma that made him exhale slowly, not from exhaustion, but as if finally letting go after months of tension. In that moment, Catherine didn't ask any more questions. She handed him gloves, showed him how to mix dough, divide the portions, bake at the right temperature, and quietly observed. Michael wasn't skilled, not right away, of course. He fumbled with the mixer, nearly spilled a tray of eggs, and forgot to set the oven timer twice. But what Catherine couldn't look away from was the way he always apologized sincerely, always tried again, and especially the way he looked at the rising dough in the oven, as if it were magic. In the middle of real life, that afternoon, as customers began to pour in, Catherine stepped out to the front counter. Michael was still in the kitchen, carefully wiping down the work surface after the last batch of bread. An elderly woman walked in, selected a few walnut cookies, and munched contentedly as she spoke with a smile. "The person who made these is new," Catherine said softly. "Today's his first day." "Oh, really?" The old woman glanced toward the kitchen. "Well, he bakes well. You can tell he cares." That evening, after the bakery had closed, Michael stayed an extra 15 minutes just to thoroughly mop the floor. As he was about to leave, Catherine handed him a white envelope. "This is your first day's pay. It's not much, but I believe effort should always be compensated fairly." Michael looked at the envelope, hesitating. "I didn't expect you to pay me today." Catherine smiled. "I'm not doing charity, Michael. I hired someone who values every hour in a day, and I was right." He took the envelope and stepped outside the shop. But just before he turned to leave, Michael paused. The golden hue of sunset quietly touched his shoulders, bathing his thin frame in a rare, almost sacred light. "Miss Catherine, thank you for seeing me. Not as someone to pity, but as someone worth starting over." Catherine stood still, her hand resting on the glass door. In that moment, she didn't reply, only nodded gently, because she too was learning how to start over, not from pain, but from trust. On a weekend afternoon, the sky over Houston hung heavy and gray, as if forewarning something yet to come. A light drizzle began to fall, tapping steadily on the tiled roof of the small bakery where Catherine and Michael were busy with the next batch. Inside, the scent of butter and milk mingled with warm cinnamon and vanilla, creating a sense of peace and comfort, a sharp contrast to the chaos that had once defined their pasts. Michael was wiping down a tray when the doorbell rang, not the brisk, familiar ding-ding of regulars, but a heavy, slow chime, as if someone had walked in carrying the weight of a lifetime. Catherine looked up, her heart skipping a beat. She froze for only a moment. But Michael, having become deeply attuned to the subtle expressions of the woman who had raised him through years of hardship, noticed even the smallest shift. The door opened. A man stepped in, tall, neatly dressed in a dark gray suit, silver-streaked hair slicked back, his face stern and composed, almost too polished to belong in a humble bakery like this. "Charles Kingsley." The name sliced through her memory like a blade. "Miss Catherine, I'm Charles, you probably remember," he said clearly. Not loudly, but each word carried weight. Catherine gave a small nod, calm. "I remember. Some people you don't need to meet more than once. Once is enough to never forget." Michael emerged from the back, his expression openly cold. "Why are you here?" Charles stared at Michael, his gaze one of someone witnessing something he couldn't quite process. A moment of stunned silence passed before he stepped closer. "You're Michael?" His voice had lowered, almost breaking. "You've grown so much." "Thanks. I grew up on my own." "Didn't need you," Michael replied, his words sharp as a knife. Catherine stepped between them, her voice steady. "What do you want?" I know I was wrong. I left. But I can't keep living pretending my son doesn't exist." "Son?" Catherine let out a dry laugh, devoid of amusement. "Michael isn't some lost possession. You forgot somewhere, and now want to retrieve." Charles tried to compose himself. "I'm not here to take anything or disrupt anyone's life. I just thought, maybe I could make amends. Give Michael a better chance, a better school, a decent family." Michael's voice was tight, laced with restrained anger. "A decent family doesn't abandon my mother when she gave birth prematurely, lying helpless in a hospital bed. Broke. Alone. Miss Catherine was there. You weren't." Silence fell. The air inside the bakery grew heavy. Charles swallowed hard, his face tense, stretched like a drawn string. "I thought, if I could bring you to live with me, you'd have a future. You want me to leave the woman who raised me on the cheapest loaves of bread every day? The one who lost sleep stitching torn seams in my shirts? I don't need a father made of money. I needed a father who was there when it hurt." Catherine stood frozen. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear of Charles, but from the emotion stirred by what Michael had just said. "You can bring money," she said softly, yet firmly. "But you can't buy memories. You can't buy the nights I stayed up holding Michael when he had a fever. You can't buy his first day of school. You can't buy the love I planted into his life, little by little." Charles was stunned. He had nothing more to say. The usual air of authority he carried now seemed empty and misplaced in this small, quiet bakery. As he turned to leave and opened the shop door, the rain outside seemed heavier. He stood still for a few seconds, then walked out. His hair soaked, his suit damp, but no one stopped him. When the door closed behind him, Michael turned to Catherine. "I'm sorry for letting him in, but I don't regret facing him." Catherine looked at him, her eyes softening. She pulled him into a hug, without words. Everything was already said in that gentle embrace where there was love, forgiveness, and the quiet certainty that they had not taken the wrong path. A few days after the confrontation with Charles, life at the small bakery seemed to return to its usual rhythm. Catherine still rose at 4 a.m., kneading dough and preparing each batch of pastries with her familiar, composed grace. But deep within, something had shifted, something vague and fragile, like morning fog that hadn't yet lifted. Michael didn't speak about Charles again. The 17-year-old still went to school on time, helped out at the shop after class, and spent his evenings studying a routine honed by years of hardship. but the look in his eyes had changed colder, yet more clear-eyed, until one late afternoon, the bakery was quiet. They were cleaning up when the doorbell chimed. It wasn't Charles. A well-dressed woman stood outside, her blonde hair curled in soft waves. She wore oversized sunglasses and a designer leather bag looped casually over her arm. Catherine frowned slightly. Michael, standing behind the counter, silently watched. "Excuse me, is this the Morning Crumbs Bakery?" the woman asked, her East Coast accent crisp. "It is," Catherine replied. "What can I help you with?" The woman removed her sunglasses. Her eyes were sharp and bright, scanning the room briefly. Then she smiled the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "I'm Helen Kingsley, Michael's stepmother. I'm here to talk, if that's okay." The air in the bakery seemed to stall, as if someone had drawn all the oxygen out of the room. Catherine and Michael exchanged a look. Michael clenched the rag in his hands, steadying himself. "No need for small talk," Catherine said flatly. "Say what you came to say." Helen stepped inside, her heels tapping a slow rhythm across the old wooden floor. She sat in the chair near the counter and pulled out a thick envelope. "Charles wants to make amends, and so do I," Helen said, her voice calm. "We can offer Michael a place to live, a better education, better living conditions, and a future worthy of his potential." Michael scoffed. "Worthy? You mean with money?" "No, with opportunity," Helen replied, pushing the envelope onto the counter. "And the condition is that, Catherine, you step out of his life." The sentence landed like a rock dropped into a still lake. Catherine said nothing, but Michael straightened, both hands on the counter, eyes blazing. "What do you think I am? Some kind of object? You think you can throw money at me, and I'll forget how my mother lived the past 17 years to raise me?" Helen remained composed. "You don't know what life really is yet. You could study in the Ivy League, work for one of the companies I have shares in. She's given you everything she could, but that's the cycle of poverty. I can give you a way out." Catherine finally spoke, her voice soft as a breeze, yet unwavering. "I don't need him to be grateful to me, but I won't let anyone turn him into someone he's not." Michael stepped out from behind the counter and picked up the envelope. He opened it, a thick wad of cash and an invitation to a special academic program in Boston. He looked at it for a few seconds, then gently placed it back on the counter and pushed it toward Helen. "I'd rather live poor and know who truly loves me than live rich and see my mother heartbroken one more time." Helen stood up and took the envelope. "You'll regret this. Opportunities don't come twice." "It's okay," Michael replied. "I've learned to value people more than opportunities." Helen turned and left without looking back. The door closed behind her, quiet, but cold. When only the two of them remained, Catherine sank into a chair. Her hand rested on her chest where her heart was still pounding from anger, worry, and love. Michael sat down beside her, placing a gentle arm around her shoulders. "I don't need their world. We have our own, and that's enough." Catherine squeezed his hand, tears spilling over her lashes. Not because she feared losing him, but because she knew the boy she'd raised had become strong enough to protect what mattered most. On a Sunday morning, just as the sun peeked softly through the trees outside the window, Catherine awoke to the sound of quiet laughter coming from the kitchen. She stepped out, still wearing the old sleep shirt with frayed shoulders, and saw a scene that melted her heart. Michael fumbling over a pan of pancakes, his face dusted with flour, eyes sparkling like a child who had just discovered magic. "You're up already, Mom. I was going to bring it to you in bed," Michael said eagerly, though his hands clumsily flipped a pancake with slightly burnt edges. Catherine smiled. "Next time, use less baking powder." Michael laughed. "Noted." Moments like these, simple but precious, soothed the lingering wounds left from the encounter with Helen and Charles. They never brought up the subject again. There was no need. Everything was clear, like early winter sunlight, cold but bright. But then, a week later, a letter arrived at the bakery, and what seemed to have ended quietly began again. Catherine opened the envelope, and inside was a handwritten letter, firm, masculine script from Charles. "Catherine, I don't expect your forgiveness. I only ask that you read this to the end. I was wrong not once, but many times. I chose the safety of my own life over facing responsibility, and you were the one who bore the weight of that choice. Seeing Michael again, I finally understood what I lost. Not just a son, but the chance to become a better man. If you'll allow it, I'd like to see Michael again, with respect and honesty. No conditions. No titles, no power. just a man hoping to learn how to be a father from his own child. Catherine sat in silence for a long time. There was no anger in her eyes, only the heavy pull of thought. The letter could never undo the years she had cried alone, but perhaps it could open a door for Michael, if he was willing. That evening, while the two of them were bagging pastries together, Catherine handed Michael the letter gently, like she used to hand him a warm glass of milk every night when he was small. Michael read it, line by line, in silence. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. When he finished, he laid it flat on the table and sat quietly, hands clasped into a fist. After a while, he spoke, his voice steady, but deep and still like a lake before a coming storm. I don't hate him. I just don't know what to do with his presence in my life. Catherine didn't interrupt. She let him sort through the emotions just as she had when he first learned to write, and each letter was its own little struggle. Eventually, Michael looked up. If he really wants to learn how to be a father, then I'll teach him. That sentence, simple and profound, brought tears to Catherine's eyes. Not from sadness, but pride. On an early winter afternoon, wind rushed through the narrow street in South Houston. Catherine stood by the bakery window, gently wiping a thin layer of dust from the glass. The sky was gray, but her heart was filled with colors too complex to name: worry, hope, and a trace of fear she didn't dare acknowledge. Across the room, Michael was carefully adjusting the collar of his shirt. He had chosen the plain white shirt Catherine had given him on his 16th birthday. It wasn't expensive, but it was clean, neatly pressed, enough to show that he was ready. "Are you sure?" Catherine asked, not looking at her son, her hand unconsciously gripping the dish towel tighter. Michael nodded. "I don't want to live my whole life with unanswered questions." When Charles stepped into the bakery, the bell above the door rang softly but carried weight. He wore a black turtleneck sweater, no longer with the formality of the first time Catherine had seen him again, but as a man whose face was now both unfamiliar and familiar, his eyes balancing uneasily between nervousness and regret. Michael stood up first. No one told him to. He chose to. "Hello, sir," Michael began. The word father was still too far away. Charles paused. He swallowed down a tight breath. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." The two of them sat at the wooden table near the window. At first, the air between them was as thick as cold fog. But Michael, with a composure beyond his years, took the initiative to break that distance. "I didn't know who you were for many years, but I never lacked anything. My mom gave me everything. Love, guidance, even dinners I knew weren't nutritious, but she always smiled." Charles said nothing. Each word cut through layers of pride he had worn like armor. "I don't need a man who says, 'I'm your father,' and then disappears," Michael continued, his voice low. "I need someone willing to sit here every week, every month, and listen, not to be praised for it." For the first time, Charles looked at the boy not as someone he felt obligated toward, but as a person who had overcome far too much and still grown up kind. "I don't know if I deserve the chance," he said quietly, "but if you give it to me, I won't leave." Michael nodded. Not in haste, but with sincerity. "Then let's start with a cup of hot cocoa, okay?" he said with a soft smile. Charles nodded, and Catherine, who had been silently watching from a distance, finally let go of the towel she'd been gripping. Her eyes shimmered with tears, but her lips curved upward, not because of what she had just witnessed, but because of what she no longer had to do alone. 3 weeks after their first meeting, Catherine's bakery still opened each Saturday morning, but now there was a new regular visitor. He always arrived early, carrying a small paper bag with a few children's books, and always asked, "What kind of filling does Michael want today?" Charles didn't try to force his way into their lives. He didn't rush to play the role of a father. Instead, he learned to simply be there at the right time, in the right way. Michael, who had once been wary, was slowly growing used to having the older man there sharing peanut butter rolls, listening to him talk about school. There were no grand conversations, but small pieces of dialogue, patient and consistent, were slowly mending the gap between two generations. One rainy afternoon, with the shop quiet and nearly empty, Charles and Catherine were restocking supplies behind the counter. Neither of them spoke, until Charles, placing a hand gently on the edge of the shelf, asked in a voice so soft it sounded afraid of disturbing the peace she had built, "Did you ever wonder if things would have been different, if I had known back then?" Catherine wiped her hands on the kitchen towel, her eyes drifting toward the chair where Michael usually sat. "It's not about what if, it's about what was. And no matter how much I think about it, it won't change anything. A brief silence followed. Then she continued, her voice softer now, no longer sharp. What matters now isn't what you missed. It's whether you still want to walk forward with us. Charles nodded, eyes glistening. Every single day, he replied. Slow is fine, as long as it's sincere. That night, after Michael had gone to bed, Catherine stood in the doorway of his room, watching him sleep, his face a mirror of Charles in his youth. She turned and walked into the kitchen, where Charles was rinsing out a glass. Could you pick him up from school tomorrow? She asked. The question came casually, but her heart beat faster than usual. Charles turned, surprise softening into something warmer. I'll be there by 3. Earlier, if needed. The ending. And the lesson that remains. Family doesn't always arrive on time, but if it comes with sincerity and persistence, it can still be right on time. A father may have once fallen short. A mother may have once been broken. A child may have grown up in the cracks of hardship, but they can still learn to be a family again, not because of blood, but because they choose to stay.